Good evening, Team Krulak community, and welcome back to another episode of Down the Rabbit Hole on the Russia-Ukraine War. We're your host, Major Ian Brown, and we are again joined by Dr. Yuval Weber, our Russian subject matter expert at the Krulak Center. And we told you we would be back again this week with another episode. Here we are, and we are doing this right on the 1 year mark of the war. It's been 24 February 2022 is when the second invasion, we should say, of Ukraine started, with Russian forces coming in from multiple axes. And as we've talked about the aftermath, obviously, for the entire year in this episode. Interesting to note, Dr. Weber had about 3 days before the invasion actually started, and it sort of looked like the writing on the wall. We sat him down, and he gave us kind of a state of play between the two sides. And as he mentioned on, I think on Twitter earlier today, you sort of feel like that episode or those slides and that interpretation still stands up. So we've already shared that out on social media today, but we'll be sure to link it back in this episode as well for those who want to take a refresher, for sort of what Yuval was looking at 3 days prior, and then sort of how it contrasts to how we see things today. So as we also said in the last episode, the main focus of this one is going to be looking at Russia's ability to stay in the war. Hopefully not for another year, but sort of what the near to intermediate term outlook is, because a lot of consensus that 2023 is going to be a pretty decisive year in the conflict in one way or the other. Well, before we do that, we are going to, it's as sort of expected. There's been a lot of, developments this week since we last talked about 3 days ago. When we last talked, we'll sort of set the stage here. It had been right after President Biden had made his visit to Kyiv to talk to Ukrainian leadership. And you've all sort of queued up that sort of stole the thunder from Putin, because Putin was getting ready to give big, powerful, awe-inspiring speech of his own. And then President Biden shows up and spends more time in Ukraine than Putin has since the invasion started. So you've all, again, welcome back. And we'll take that kind of as the starting point here for some of the things that have happened over the last few days before we get to the big topic of this episode.
No, thank you, Ian. And when we started this, obviously it's now February 2023, and I believe we started thinking about this more seriously, or sort of like this seems to be it, really in mid 2021. And so just to sort of like put us into the context of how we're getting to like Russia getting out of New START, and then we'll talk about what we've observed over the course of the past year, so that we can try at least forecast what's coming over the next one. Is that just to put us back, in April of 2021, basically the Russian the troops start massing along Ukraine's border. And that's what got President Biden and President Putin to meet in Switzerland of June 2021. And the big result of that meeting was something that they called strategic stability talks. And from the American perspective, that meant, getting back to the table on in terms of nuclear arms control, which is again one of the things that we're going to talk about in just a second. Because when President Biden came into office, one of the big questions that he had was whether to extend New START. The issue at that time was, are the Russians really serious about this? Aren't they already cheating? Why should the United States bind itself if the Russians aren't? President Trump had gotten out of a lot of nuclear arms control agreements, because effectively they reflected the Cold War era, and not an era in which China is a major international military power. And so President Biden, when he came in, he just extended New START without much difficulty. Just said that's what we're going to do. And so over the course of the next couple of months, it became clear that when the Russians were talking about strategic stability, it was about revising the rules of the international order, revising the international security architecture, and to revise basically how Europe works. And the demands that they gave in November 2021 were effectively Ukraine has to cease any reasonable attempt at sovereignty, and NATO has to cancel itself. And that was really like when we started thinking, how are we going to really prepare, in essence, like as the Krulak Center for this issue coming up. And when we actually got to, the days before the conflict, it really got to the point thinking it's just a matter of hours or days at this point. It's it's just too much. There's too grave an audience cost to pull back now, particularly because neither the Ukrainians nor sort of the broader West are backing down. And that sort of all leads up to the thing that I said to you when we first started, and I think it's in the very first episode, is I hope we're not doing this for a long time. And that's like the core thing, when we think to commemorate the victims of the invasion and we think to commemorate, and honor in a certain sense, how the Ukrainians have really defended their freedom and their country to the maximum of their capabilities, is how much longer is this going to last? So when thinking about that, is sort of like, reminiscing about the past year. Over the past week, we've gotten to the point that there's another one of my favorite phrases about the US-Russia relationship, which is that it can always get worse. And as you queued it up, Biden stepped all over Putin's feet by going to Kyiv right before Putin was about to give basically his version of the State of the Union address. And in Biden going there, really just to bring this back, how unprecedented this is. This is the first time in modern U.S. history that a U.S. president has gone to a war zone in which the United States military did not have a presence. I had to go back to President Lincoln, going to really sort of like confront the Confederate armies in the field to a point where there was a U.S. president in danger. So in response, because Putin had to do something, otherwise he would be accused of just, taking the L, he announced that Russia was going to suspend its participation in the New START treaty. Upon further inspection, it appears that this was just a recognition of the status quo. The big thing about the New START treaty is that it limits the number of both warheads and missiles that each side can possess. And one, Russia's already been developing weapons that exceed that, ostensibly like putting in the production lines to exceed and break that treaty. And also they were already producing weapons that violated the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty that President Trump abrogated, I believe at this point, it's about 3 years ago. But part of the New START is that both sides are able to inspect each other's facilities. And, perhaps in this day and age, commercial satellites and whatever sort of like government satellites that both sides possess, you probably don't need these. But as just a way of creating confidence building measures in the relationship, and as well as just providing opportunities to interact, that's essentially something that is gone by the wayside, as it were. The inspections were suspended at the beginning of COVID, and at the conclusion of COVID, at least in government terms, they were not restored. They became part of, the larger deterioration of relations between the two sides. So Russia not being in START anymore actually doesn't change very much at all. It does say, there could be the norm of nuclear non-proliferation got that much weaker. There's one less opportunity for the American and Russian sides to interact, but ultimately it is what it is. We can go on for a while about nuclear arms, but, we can carry on to what you called it as the Chinese delegation in Moscow, as the benefactors come. Putin took out the small table, to meet more face-to-face than before. And it really did have the air of a person saying he may be behind on his payments, but don't worry, he's good for it. Just making sure that the bankers come, however upset the bankers come, ensure that they leave as happy as possible. So what were your take on Putin bringing out the small table for the Chinese?
Yeah, well, having the sort of the size of Putin's table has been a benchmark, if you will, of I think even going back to maybe that last episode of the Brewcast before the invasion started. I think we had a picture of that in there, but it's always been there's sort of the physical separation of I am far from you, as in like I'm kind of far above you kind of thing that the table thing implied, as well as the fact that that it's quite a visual thing of Putin sort of dominating over who was sitting around the table. So I think I noted that we'd exchanged either some text or some tweets about it, but it was striking to me, like it was clearly this is not the same circumstances, that the context around this meeting had changed. It actually sort of reminded me a little bit as well of the sort of the subtext of that novel you recommended to me many moons ago. It's sort of a future Russia, sort of it with this mixture of like high technology and then still sort of like low level primal, barbarism. But always hanging in the subtext was that Russia was basically at a point where they were beholden to China for a lot of things, and they were no longer quite the independent power that they thought they were. Who's to say that this is something that is actually going to develop over the next year? Because another thing this week, there were some news stories about U.S. had some intelligence they might be ready to release in case China wanted to cross the line of non-lethal aid to lethal aid to Russia, because that would certainly have some battlefield implications, because the Chinese industrial bases and economy is not under the same level of sanctions as the Russian one is. So, Russia finding a new injection of war materials certainly a potential cause for concern. But yeah, the air in the room seemed different in this one, and Putin is never certainly never going to admit it, but the message, unless you're a real hardcore Russian, seems to be you're asking for help now. You're going hand in hand to your good friends who you want to sit close by, right? But I got to imagine that you've talked about this before too. Putin has some pretty strong like personal space issues just in general.
Hmm.
So for him to probably bite the inside of his mouth and not start screaming, but with these people being that close to him, that point as well, I think. I'm not trying to read tea leaves, but it seems to be an indicator of how desperately he needs outside, an injection from somebody else outside, that he is willing to sacrifice both the image of the table, right? Me dominating my giant table, as well as being just in such close proximity to people at all. Yeah, that must have been a bitter thing for him to swallow, to have to do that.
Yeah, so two things. One, the novel, which to the listeners or viewers is called Day of the Oprichnik by Vladimir Sorokin, is truly perhaps a very good picture of what the Russia's future might look like. Eventually, they have their dignity, but only in the sense of being able to engage in whatever barbarism they like. But basically, the Chinese own the state at that point. I should also just warn the listeners and viewers, it has perhaps the most shocking sex scene I've ever read in a novel. I first read that book maybe 20 years ago, 15, 20 years ago. I was never the same thereafter. So, content warning, even if you are under the age of 90, just be careful with that one.
Yes, and Yuval, I know this sidebar and move on, but you gave me fair warning, right? That yeah, it's not for the faint of heart, and I say this as someone who has watched all of Game of Thrones and sort of other shows that never really flinch from stuff, and you need a little bit of iron in your stomach to sort of to power through that, the last part. But anyway, I thought, like, outside of that, I still think the author's construct here was very very pertinent, and we'll see how far along the Chinese rail lines that the Russia has to go to get to that point. But that sort of maybe the seeds of that are something that we saw in this meeting this week.
And we know, and there was sort of, we'll get to sort of thinking about Russia's economy in just a second. But when you mentioned that he's had to sacrifice his personal space, we've seen Putin in recent days, address basically like the Russian elite, address to the Federal Assembly. He's had to do some public speeches, and all the people around him are generally no closer than maybe 50 to 100 feet. And certainly when he meets with his subordinates, like the actual foreign minister, like basically head of intelligence, things of that nature, these are not people who are sitting more than 25 feet close to him. And he had to have his trusty lieutenants literally sitting beside him. And that at its core has got to rankle. And sort of like when you see people on the way down, like A Star is Born, the rooms get smaller, and that seemed to be for Putin. So obviously, the reason the Chinese are there are they basically need to, check in on their investment, but also to a larger extent, really trying to understand, for the Chinese and for everyone in the world, what does a Russia after this war is over look like? And so what we wanted to do with this particular episode is to really try to understand, in effect, what was the Russian economy basically on the eve of the conflict? What have we seen in the past year? What are we going to see in the next year? And then in effect, what are Russia's futures? And obviously, one of them is deeply disturbing sex scenes. That's an option that's on the table. But really, when we think about, and I prepare some slides, and hopefully, like this, I'll read them out for people who listen. But obviously, people who are watching on YouTube will be able to sort of like, look at the pictures at the same time. The key story of how Putin has been able to stay in power for more than 20 years is that Russian political culture and his hold on power has never been about optimizing for economic growth. And how sort of basically how does this work? How has he stayed in power for more than 20 years? Putin has had essentially he has two extreme talents that have more or less held up even to this day. The first thing is obviously like the country that he inherited was not in good shape. And, part of that was they not only did they lose their superpower status, they lost a lot of their territory, which obviously created, grievance and resentment. They effectively lost a war against a rebellious province, Chechnya, who basically fought to, Vietnam-like draw, victory in all but name. And then, they also underwent two really severe economic crises. Their currency collapsed in 1998, and their basic economy collapsed over the course of really sort of 92 to 94. And this was, in the early half of the 1990s, or the first half of the 1990s, they experienced a sustained economic contraction that was worse than the Great Depression, and they were experiencing bouts of hyperinflation that lasted for months on end, that was worse than Weimar Germany. And only Zimbabwe under the era of Robert Mugabe and Venezuela in the early days of Nicolas Maduro actually had worse inflation. So really, when we think about the economy of Russia, the thing that Putin retrospectively looked at in terms of the 1990s, in order to build essentially the country that we observe today, is that going for economic growth at all costs, which is more or less what like a lot of countries try to do, that essentially leaves Russia too vulnerable to the international markets. And Putin's key success is that he has made a Russia that may not be as wealthy as it could be, but a Russia that is far more resilient than what it had in the 1990s. And a Russia that is essentially far more integrated into the world economy compared to what the Soviet Union was, but not as beholden to the international economy as what even happened during the 1990s. So when we think about sort of like what's the big picture before we get to like what's happening right now, Putin's key success in really the first, 2 decades of his rule is that he was able to create stability, and then he optimized for it. And by optimizing for stability and resilience instead of growth, he was able to control a lot of Russian politics. And part of that is what we see is that by the time, the first big oil boom comes in, which is in the year 2003, 2004, he's already defeated the oligarchs as a political, class. He's arrested Russia's richest person, Mikhail Khodorkovsky, sent him to jail, expropriated the company, and turned what was Yukos, like Russia's most valuable company, into a state-owned enterprise. That's the basis of Rosneft today. So by defeating the oligarchs and then co-opting them as a potential political threat, that's essentially the Putin that when the oil money starts to come in the mid 2000s, he's able to, fix pension and wage arrears, i.e. people who hadn't been paid in a long time. He's able to rebuild roads. He's able to build, hospitals, schools, all these sorts of things. So when we think about what is Putin's essentially image in the minds of basically like, tens of millions of ordinary Russians, it was life was bad before him. After he came in, life materially improved. And that's a lot of the source of legitimacy that he's been able to work on for the past number of years. And so by essentially creating a lot more stability within the country, he's also able, by defeating all the various challenges to his power, the oligarchs, the Chechens, the governors at that time, he's been able to create stability at the top by being the person who can balance all those different elite factions. And so in the sense of what is the story of the Russian economy over the past year, on the eve of the conflict itself, Russia was actually posed to have a pretty fantastic 2022. The world was getting out of COVID. Economic recovery would have meant, huge demand for oil and gas, because if production had gone down over the course of COVID, that would have been salad days, as it were, for the Russian economy. And so Russia was posed for, according to a series of, from the World Bank and from the IMF and from their own Ministry of Finance, somewhere between 2 to 4 percentage points of GDP growth. They would have been able to restock their national wealth fund and basically have enough money and a relatively light sanctions regime in order to basically withstand the existing sanctions regime. And that would have been a moment in which Putin may have been dissatisfied with not achieving the legacy that he wanted in terms of the destruction of Ukraine, but Russia would have been wealthier. And again, the reason I start with this big discussion about Russia's political culture is that Putin has been in power for more than 20 plus years, not by optimizing for economic growth, but by optimizing for regime stability and resilience in the face of external pressures. And as we've talked about for an entire year, he thought this was going to be over in a span of days to weeks, maybe months, in terms of reorganization of whatever was left of Ukraine. So he was not thinking that this was going to be anything other than a walk in the park. And as I went over, the presentation from basically a year ago or so, all the stuff about Putin, all the speeches that he was giving at that time, just brimmed with anger that Ukraine existed and supreme confidence that that would soon no longer be the case. So this is a point, where we can start to think what actually happened when the war started. So really the first thing that happened was the crisis. And, it starts here with a picture of people standing in front of a bank. And they're standing in front of Alpha Bank. And these are people who are going to try and extract as much cash as possible. And so the first few days of the war is once the Russian people understood that, even though the president had said for the previous 6 months, if not 10 months at that point, that there was not going to be a war, all of a sudden there was a war. And so they're trying to take out as much cash as possible. So the immediate impact on the Russian economy at that time was a worse currency shock than the one that brought down the ruble in 1998. At a certain point, the ruble had gone from roughly about 75 to the dollar to 150 to the dollar. So losing half your basically foreign currency holdings more or less overnight. And this is where we start to understand what did the Russian policymakers, economic policymakers do. And this is really the head of the Russian central bank, Elvira Nabiullina, the special advisor, economic advisor to the president, Maxim Oreshkin, the minister of finance, Anton Siluanov, and the prime minister, Mikhail Mishustin. They basically, put their heads together and turned out to be the only truly competent part of the Russian government over the past year. And what they did is they basically recognized this is a disaster and this is going to last an indefinite period of time. And Nabiullina, who's really the leader of this group, made the decision that basically there's going to be a crisis of unknown depth and duration, and that the answer to this is going to be letting the Russian people just have their living standards fall. And what basically the rest of this presentation is going to be about is basically that decision, that in effect, the Russian state needs all the money available to fight the war. It needs all the money available in order to basically continue funding the security services so that, one, there's stability in the regions, two, there's no coup attempts against Putin, and that, three, there's enough money left that basically they have these pots of gold in Moscow, which leaves all the various ministries, all the various regions, all the various, oligarchs, whatever, to lobby Moscow instead of trying to find some way out of the war. And that's really, in effect, what the economic leadership of Russia did. They closed the stock exchanges indefinitely, and which turned out to be just a couple months. They prohibited foreign investors from exiting Russian positions. They no longer service debt on short-term bonds to foreigners. They just went into a controlled default, and they imposed a $10,000 limit on removing currency from the country. And so basically overnight, they understood a crisis is coming, and they just said, we're going to pause everything until such time as it is no longer needed. And at that point, Russia then experienced a sanctions regime that is the most extensive on any major economy in probably history. No major economy, even considering Japan, in the run up to World War II, has experienced a sanctions regime quite like the one that's in Russia, that's on Russia right now. And so the sanctions regime limits Russia's ability to advance as a modern economy, just full stop. Now, when people talk about sanctions, there's a lot of debate. Are sanctions working or not? If we think about sanctions as a way of compelling or deterring specific policy positions from Russia taking, then it hasn't worked, because Russia, in a certain sense, and Vladimir Putin, in a certain sense, is undeterrable. He wanted to destroy Ukraine no matter what, and the no matter what is basically the sanctions regime that we're observing. But in terms of personal sanctions on basically everyone in Russian government, aviation technology, Nord Stream 2 never got online. The Russians also blew up Nord Stream 1. Bank sanctions, retail and development bank sanctions. So how they basically fund their infrastructure, shipping and insurance sanctions, sovereign debt restrictions, expulsion from SWIFT, semiconductor export controls, the final product rule, which means that Russia can't import all the microchips that it needs, which has led it to various attempts to smuggle those in from refrigerators. The imports of refrigerators to Russia has skyrocketed, via Armenia and Kazakhstan, in order to repurpose those for military purposes. But in effect, the sanctions and the sanctions on Russia's central bank, Ministry of Finance, National Wealth Fund, and on Belarus coming from Europe meant that a lot of Russia's money was also frozen abroad. All of these things combined has made Russia both poorer and has identified the limits of how Russia can grow. So the sanctions have not been successful in terms of changing Russian behavior, but they have been successful in terms of creating what we'll talk about in a little bit, which is a Russia that is going to be demonstrably and durably poorer for years to come. The Russia that will exist after this war is going to be far poorer and far more removed from the international economy than the one that existed before this war began. So when we talked about the Chinese coming in, the Chinese are going to get all the natural resources they want. They're going to name their price, and Russia will say, yes, that is our sovereignty. Combined with this, when we think about Russia's deglobalization, the picture here for those who are listening is basically just a sample of firms that have left Russia. And this is really in all parts of, the modern economy: energy and aviation, automotive, banking, logistics, retail, entertainment, tech firms, quite literally everything that a country needs in order to be integrated into sort of the global world, that no longer exists. Russia has to engage in basically restarting brand new supply chains, brand new logistic chains, because the existing ones no longer work. And earlier in the year, or earlier in the conflict, we talked about how when Russia basically did not give back all the planes that were basically leased to all the various Russian air companies, and they basically stole all their planes. There are no more imports of legitimate like airplane parts into Russia. So in recent months, Russia has now approved the production of 3D printed parts to go into their planes. So good luck flying into Russia. And so Russia's deglobalization has basically meant that, they went through several different ideas on how they could use their economic leverage on the outside world in order to try and limit basically the Western support to Ukraine. At first, they thought, they would create food insecurity. That is by inhibiting Ukrainian uh, foodstuffs exports, as well as just destroying Ukrainian, agriculture and prohibiting the export of agriculture from their own country. That this would create food insecurity worldwide, and especially in the global South. That civil instability in the global South would result, leading to government instability, leading to migration flows to Europe. This is in effect their playbook from Syria. By creating migration flows from Syria into Europe, that helped create a political crisis that for sure helped Brexit over the line, and also brought a number of far-right political parties to power across Europe. And that is basically how they're trying to shape domestic political processes in Europe in order to create much more Ukraine skeptic political leaders or parties that would then be more friendly to Russia. That was stopped when Turkey and the United Nations forced Russia to the negotiating table. Turkey said that it was going to send the ships in any case, and that if Russia wanted to start a war with NATO over food supplies by hitting Turkish ships, that they were more than free to do so. So we got the Black Sea grain deal out of that. Russia's next idea was to create an energy crisis by basically using the energy weapon of cutting off energy exports into Europe, that this would create economic crises as Europe would freeze in the winter. Instead, the Europeans strongly resupplied their energy stockpiles and decoupled from imports from Russia, and it was just a very warm winter. So climate change really benefited the geopolitical outcome of this conflict. And so in that regard, Russia then got to the mobilization strategy, which we're observing right now, is that in effect, what we're observing is Russia viewing the conflict as not one in which they can win through quality, but through quantity. They've mobilized several 100,000 people over the last couple of months. And the big idea here is Ukraine will run out of citizens long before Russia does, because Ukraine is less than 1/3 the size. And where we get into Russia in terms of thinking about how the course of the past year has gone, part of the Russian, economic situation is that they had a great run at the beginning of 22 because there was an energy shock. They were selling, and before basically the price caps came in, and before Europe decoupled, they really enjoyed a really big opportunity to make quite a lot of money. And so even though the deglobalization and sanctions regime came in, they were still able to make quite a lot, and they had a really good trade balance surplus at the beginning of the conflict. But over time, this will basically come to an end as well. Part of that is imports, because of the sanctions regime, have declined dramatically. So just Russia has a lot less stuff to bring in order to make their economy as efficient as possible. In a sense, that's good for the war efforts, good for the state coffers, but it's bad for the population. And in addition to that, a sea change in how Europe deals with Russia has occurred. Europe took this moment to decouple itself from Russia. They framed the invasion as a challenge to Europe, and Russia's, or I should say, Europe's leaders, specifically the president of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, and the head and the Chancellor of Germany, Olaf Scholz, effectively acknowledged that one, Putin lied to them, that Russia is basically no different from the Russia of Stalin's time. It's no different from the Russia of the 19th century and the 18th century, etc. So if you can't deal with them, what can you do with them? And what the Europeans effectively decided to do was use this as a generational opportunity to reach all of their climate goals. By getting Germany, and the Germans did this themselves, to basically get off the cheap Russian energy, they ended 50 years of German grand strategy, which was to shape Russia through an economic relationship, the Ostpolitik, as it were. So in effect, what the chart here on the left is the EU's diversification away from Russian gas. So by 2019, traditionally speaking, Russia provided about half of European energy, with obviously the bulk of that going to Germany, some going to Turkey, etc., for gain, use in Germany and redistribution from Turkey to the rest of Southeast Europe. And what we see over the course of the chart here is that the mix of Russian energy has gone from the dominant supplier into Europe into a supplier into Europe. Russian energy now accounts for about 15% of gas imports into Europe. And that is something that the Europeans have said is sustainable. That Russia is no longer this swing producer of basically the European energy markets. The bulk has then been taken up by LNG, liquefied natural gas imports from the United States and Qatar, just conservation, as well as more from Norway. And more on that as the years develop. In terms of the international energy market, what we can see here is that the Western world, as it were, the pro-Ukraine coalition, which is roughly about 65 countries, have basically gone against Russia's energy exports in a very specific way. They have instituted price caps on Russian energy. And how do they enforce that? They have sanctioned Russia's energy export chain. And so for any company that provides insurance or shipping or anything that physically gets the oil or gas from Russia to Europe itself, or to the outside, or to Europe itself, that company will be sanctioned by the EU. So obviously, European companies don't want to get sanctioned by the EU because that's their entire business. And that's how the EU and sort of like the broader West has been able to institute price caps of $60 per barrel of crude, $100 for refined petroleum products, $45 for other refined products. And that's how, over time, Europe is leading the way in reducing Russia's oil and gas revenues. And part of that, and so what we can see is that this is the stuff that's really going to make a difference. Less money coming into Russia, and this is forcing the Russians to in fact sell their oil at lower prices, because as European demand has decreased, the amount that is being imported into or exported into China and India has increased dramatically. But it's at this point that the Indians and Chinese look at the price that the Europeans are buying and say, you know what, that's our discount as well. So in effect, the price cap is working by giving the Indians and the Chinese, the major importers of Russian energy in Asia, the opportunity to have the discount of a century. And revenue commodities are roughly 45% of Russia's government income. So they cannot easily cut production, even if they really resent the fact that the Chinese and the Indians have a brand new price ceiling. This has led to massive declines in the billions of dollars per month that basically Russia is earning. And in the chart that you see here is that over the course of 2021, the amount of money that Russia was earning was increasing from 5 to roughly $11 billion over the course of 2021, which is the general sense of the world is recovering out of COVID. Russia's making more money, not essentially by exporting anymore, but just the price of oil has gone up. And so that as basically the war comes in, they enjoy the price shock. But as the EU crude embargo and price caps are implemented, the amount of money that they're making per month is starting to go down. And at this point, Russia's earning less. even though they're exporting more. And in the big picture, that's essentially part of what's going to happen to the Russians. What we can see in the chart on the left is that Russia was able to, experience a pretty intense COVID shock, and then, oil price recovery, from 2020 to 2021 into 22. And so that effectively Russia's GDP is somewhere between -2 to perhaps, maybe -4% over the course of 2022, and then thinking into 2024. So that even when Russia's economy recovers, it'll recover to a much lower level. And so the oil volume and price increase means that they may be exporting less, earning less, and without any other viable sources of income, the trade surplus that they've enjoyed is going to start to decrease over time. And here's where we sort of get to the idea of how much money is going to be in the Russian economy going forward. The chart here shows, in terms of billions of rubles on the left y-axis, and the percent of GDP on the right y-axis of Russia's national wealth fund. Now, countries are not like individuals, but at the end of the day, if Russia's cut off from the outside world, except for the revenues they get from energy exports, the national wealth fund is the piggy bank that they're using, that is effectively the debit card or like the checking account. Once it's over, they're basically living paycheck to paycheck. And so what we can see here is that, in effect, Russia really basically was saving for this war in a concerted way, really starting in mid 2019. This is before COVID, but clearly, like, the anger about Ukraine was increasing over time, and this is probably tied to the victory of Zelensky at some point. The money starts to come in substantive amounts in 2020 as well, but really, as the war starts to increase, the amount of money that is now in the National Wealth Fund has decreased by roughly 15% just over the course of the past year. And the height of Russia's National Wealth Fund, in terms of being a percent of GDP, has gone from 12% to roughly just a bit above 7% over the course of the past year. This is the chart that, as it gets updated over time, and this is the chart that's going to pay for the war. It's going to pay for the security services. It's going to pay for, fixing all the holes in the budget. As this approaches zero, this is the chart that defines how long Russia has left in terms of fighting. So if it declines from 12% to 7% in a year, we're asking ourselves, what does that look like in terms of, going from roughly, 14 trillion rubles to 11 trillion rubles in a year? If it declines by another 3 trillion, that suggests that Russia has somewhere between 3 to 3.5 years to go. Of course, we can think of a bank run, and once basically things start to get a bit wobbly, it would be even faster than that. So when we think about what has Russia been spending over this past year, I looked up basically what was Russia's defense spending over the past year and their security services spending. According to the state budget, which again, who knows at this point, they spent in 2022 4.7 trillion rubles on the defense budget. And I use rubles because I don't want to get into discussions about purchasing power parity, or the price of the ruble versus like other things, because they're not importing anything of tremendous value. Makes more sense to use rubles. They spent in 22 4.7 trillion rubles for the defense budget, 2.8 trillion rubles for the security services, of which roughly half went to Russian security services operating in Ukraine. So during that time, if we assume 80% of defense spending, 50% of security services spending went to the war in Ukraine, with the rest needed for other defense needs, maintaining government stability at home, we have a general sense, just to sort of give these numbers. Using the average 2022 ruble to dollar exchange rate, they spent something like $76.4 billion on the war in 2022. The estimates for the 2023 budget 5 trillion rubles for defense, 4.2 trillion rubles for the security services. If we use the sort of the same back of the envelope calculations, that means, somewhere between, let's say, 6.1 trillion rubles or maybe $90.3 billion is basically just budgeted for this war. And this is to the point that we've been talking about. What does the rest of this war look like? We can just assume that this is the floor, because the longer that this war goes on, the more they're going to need victory at any cost. And the phrase at any cost is going to start to do a lot more work. And that's where we're going to start to see that national wealth fund be drained more and more quickly. And there won't be the oil and gas revenues to replenish it at the same rate. When we think about how long does Russia have left, 1, 2, 3, 3.5 years. And this is essentially like the key result of this conflict. Putin is mortgaging Russia's future in order to gain victory now. Classic boomer say thing to do. Shout out to my boomers, including my very wonderful parents, I should say. But in terms of where this leaves Russia, the last point that I'll put in is Russia has lost 3 big wars, in its modern history. The Crimean War of the mid-19th century, the War of 1905, in a certain sense, World War I. And Russia had 3 very different outcomes to those 3 conflicts. One, after the Crimean War, they recognized the government was the problem. They engaged in what we would now call root and branch reform, whole of government reform, and were able to essentially rejuvenate the entire country to the extent that they won their next big one against the Ottoman Empire in the 1870s. They lose in 1905, and basically after a brief reform effort, they jettison all of that and go back to a deeply authoritarian, deeply nationalistic way of engaging with the outside world, and that leads to the revolution in 1917. And Lenin basically, as a result of the state death of the Russian Empire, ends Russia's Soviet Union's, participation in the conflict. So in terms of, when the end of the Russian economy is going to happen, who knows? It's going to be between 1 and 3 years, but there's going to be a good sense that once this is done, it's not a guarantee that Putin's going to leave power. And if he stays in power, Russia is going to be in an even worse position than before, because they will be in a position where they lost the war, all the anger and jealousies and grievances and so forth. Ukraine will be rebuilt. That's sort of guaranteed. That's sort of baked in already. And Russia will be left further behind. And that's, in a sense, when we think about the next year of the conflict, Russia certainly has enough money to keep it going. Who knows about the year after that? And certainly the year after that does not look good. So we can expect over the course of the next conflict, Russia's probably going to think, let's withstand the next counteroffensive, and let's put as many bodies as possible there. And I think I've been speaking without break for quite a while, so let me just pause now and re-engage conversation.
Yeah, so I'll give you a break, and that was an extended discourse, but I think this is incredibly. It's good to put this information, put the stake in the ground, so everybody can sort of chew on it as a marker in the coming months, because again, this goes back to one of the clocks we were talking about, which one runs out first. We sort of have a vision now of when that raw fiscal clock could potentially run out. And that is still potentially subject to a lot of other variables. As you mentioned, at any cost, and we talked about right before we started, one of our related points to this was, okay, how long can the Russian economy go on? But then also, how long can the Russian army go on? And there's a relationship there in terms of, cost of material equipment, all the stuff it takes to, keep a fighting force in the field. But there's also a human cost. And one of the things we were talking about here before we started was how much of that human cost can, certainly can the Russian society absorb up to a point, because they've already taken, both Ukraine and Russia casualty figures have probably a fair margin of error to both of them. But, I think it's fair to say that the Russian, fatalities on the battlefield, we crossed the 100,000 mark maybe a few months back, I think.
Yeah.
And if you take your standard sort of, times 3 wounded, 400,000 casualties in a year. Like that is a staggering number that we have not seen, I don't know, since the Second World War in a major conflict. I hope I'm not forgetting some piece of history. If I am, I'll make sure I correct myself in a future episode. But that's a staggering loss of your population. Again, Ukraine has probably suffered something close to 100,000 casualties or so as well. But that's already massive human cost. How much longer is Russian society willing to absorb its sons not coming back? I don't want to oversimplify, but the empty chairs around the table, right? Like eventually, kind of going back to the table point of Putin, right? Like if you're used to having a bunch of people around your table and they're not there anymore, that's something that you notice, and that's only going to continue if they keep pulling more bodies out. And again, another point that we mentioned in a past episode was the mortgaging the future. The more people you pull into this war effort, the more Russians, the less people you have to sustain what's left of the economy. So that's sort of that 3 to 3.5 years. Maybe if we take conditions today and the workforce today going forward, if they mobilize more people, that workforce is going to shrink even further. So that's that larger cost is one thing to look at, but also we mentioned the Russian military itself. What is their ability to absorb more casualties and stay as a cohesive fighting force? Again, I don't want to oversimplify like the Russian character of war and the character of the Russian soldier. The Russian soldier today is not the same as the Russian soldier fighting Napoleon, and it's not the same as the Russian soldiers fighting, the Germans World War I, World War II, or in Afghanistan. However, historically, Russian armies have taken massive catastrophic losses of life, either in killed or captured, with entire armies getting encircled and destroyed. But they've been able to regenerate and put more people in, and there's a level of absorbing punishment that the Russian military historically has had. I think it's an open question. I didn't really have a good answer when we were talking earlier, but that's something that I think is we're watching the economic clock and the ability of the Russian economy to sort of continue limping along. How much more can the Russian military take before it hits a breaking point? And I don't know, but I think some of the things to watch and some of the variables I think to consider that are, one, they've already taken massive losses over the last year. And we talked last episode about how you want to talk about like mortgaging your economic future, their horrible performance and, their planning and execution of the initial invasion. It cost them a lot of good material, but it also cost them their most experienced and knowledgeable sort of professional soldier base, right? You're going to have sort of not a cliff, but a decline in overall performance because you mortgage that up front for a lightning, thunder run into Kyiv and you didn't get it. Well, now your baseline of experience is that much lower. So your future force is going to continue to be less and less capable as this goes on. And I think we sort of mentioned it last episode too, the little Russian offensive that couldn't. We were expecting, I think another offensive in the form of what we saw a year ago. We have not seen that, and we discussed how that was probably characteristic of that diminishing offensive capability of what's left of the Russian military even after mobilization, because they had the bodies, but the knowledge and experience of how to stitch those bodies together into an effective combined arms offensive force, they didn't really operate that way in the initial invasion. And then they are far less capable of doing that now because a lot of the people who know how to do that are dead. So I think the question is going to be, when the Ukrainian counteroffensive comes, if the Russian force continues to expend itself, again, that victory at any cost, like trying to produce victories in the near term, what is that going to do in grinding down the Russian forces on the line now? And what condition will they be in when Ukraine punches back? And that's going to, I think, be something to watch. The ability to resist that counterstroke, it's again related to the economy, because as the Russian soldier is suffering, it's not going to get any better for them, right? Like the stuff that's in their hands right now, that you might get more bodies, but what do you give those bodies, to shoot back and to maneuver with, et cetera? And we were doing some comparison to, how did the Russian absorb all those losses in World War II, right? Well, part of it was as long as basically, Russia could keep putting people on the front lines, Stalin would provide the bodies, America would provide the stuff. And there's a definite moral, not in the sense of right and wrong, but that's a moral strength when you know that you will be able to have things to fire back with. Well, in looking at the state of the Russian economy now, and whether or not Chinese benefactors provide some measure of aid, that is not nearly the same level as what kept the Soviet Union in the fight in World War II. So if you're the Russian soldier and you're like, oh, the best I'm going to get is like maybe Iran builds like a knockoff drone factory here in the coming year, that's not enough, not nearly enough, and that does nothing for me today, right now. So how and when and if that breaking point comes, I don't know. It's the same as does the Russian economy continue a downward trajectory in a linear fashion or not? But maybe I think the thing to watch is other analysts have said it. But things can unravel slowly and then they unravel very quickly. So we may not know when that breaking point is going to be, but it's possible that when either the economy or the Russian military hits it, it's going to fly out of control in pretty short order because there's no resilience in it left.
So when we put all of those things together, we need to be careful about assuming that all change is like monotonics or like evenly spaced and everything is linear. So in the regard of what we've seen, and just again, the reason I keep mentioning like the National Wealth Fund is because that's the cushion. And so just like the United States has this like crazy power of just issuing as much debt as it wants because the demand for US treasuries is effectively infinite, like for all intents and purposes. No one's very interested in buying Russian bonds, like Russian, and many countries in the world are prohibited from doing so because of sanctions. So Russia really does have to live within its means before it gets into basically a very difficult situation. And so it's the difference of someone who can live off a credit card versus someone who has to live off a debit card. That's the core thing here. So from the beginning of the conflict to where it is right now, Russia's like national wealth fund, when it entered February 2022, was 13.6 trillion rubles. It's now at 10.8. That's just after this year. So this is, in a certain sense, the best year that Russia has. Because if we assume, and I think it's a safe assumption, that the Russian economy is not going to improve at all, we're then just asking ourselves, is it going to decline at the same pace, or will that increase in any way? Will the Russian economy be worse this year in a year-on-year comparison? And so we can start to think that if Russia's strategy is we'll supply basically the bodies and as much Iranian material as we can produce or as we can get, and we'll start producing maybe we're not going to produce modern weaponry that relies on microchips, but we'll have like a lot more stuff that would have been familiar to people of the 40s, 50s, 60s. Fair enough. Each one of these, if the last mobilization was 300,000 people, that's 1% of Russia's workforce, like just adult workforce. And in that case, in the same way that if you keep breaking apart different units because too many people get killed and the combat effectiveness of like any one platoon or company or division or whatever else basically becomes unfit for purpose. It's the same thing with an industrial economy. If you take away too many people and you don't have the efficiency gains to overcome the loss of individuals, and Russia's economy is not becoming any more efficient because basically the IT sector has moved out, and Russia's lost 500,000 to a million of basically its most educated citizens over the past year, is that the year number 2 of this conflict could in fact be much worse. And so even if they're having to spend more on the war, i.e. the military itself, more on security services to maintain stability, and they have to basically keep throwing more money at various parts of society in order to keep things moving along, it could very well be that the second year of conflict is in fact much more expensive than the first one because they've run out of all the good stuff in the first year and they're spending more to stay in the same spot in the second. So for all intents and purposes, this is Putin's year. Because if he gets to 2024, like if we're having, God help us, if we're continuing to like make this series a year from today, talking the second anniversary of the conflict, we're going to be talking about a Russia that is in much more dire financial straits than it was today. Today, the resilience is there. And to me, it's not exactly obvious what's the condition of Russian resilience a year from now.
Yeah, and I think a good. I'll make one final point here, and then we can probably look at putting this one to bed. But that increased financial, the burn rate and sort of the economic shortfall starting to feed themselves. We all know that also economies are subject to human emotion in a very strong way. This is why I look at sort of the at all cost, all the different aspects on the battlefield and the economy, the Russian workforce and the Russian population that's got to soak this all up. Human dynamics and human emotions can come into play in a way that we simply can't forecast. Again, to a sort of things unraveling slowly then quickly. Kind of like the bank run at the very beginning of the invasion, right? What if there's a repeat, or what if there's some other sort of widespread fear or pessimism among the Russian population about it could be some random thing we can't even think of, like some consumer item that just goes away and everybody loses their minds. But yeah, I think there's a lot of variables at play where that burn rate and that rate of decline are easily subjected to some additional shocks that could make it exponentially worse in a pretty short time.
Here's to hoping we don't reach our second anniversary.
Yes, I reiterate the. I do hope we continue having conversations over the next year.
Yeah.
In personal capacities and after I get out of the Marine Corps, et cetera. But it'll definitely be very disappointing if there's I guess we're into season 2 now, if you will, if there's a season 3 of this, hoping that it's not. Thank you as always, Yuval. I think this is definitely, it's good to have like kind of a long or a really in-depth look at some of this stuff to kind of have a good benchmark to compare against as the next month. And, again, hopefully not a year goes by, but in the coming months to have as a reference point, I think is very valuable for our audience. And we've definitely gotten the feedback that, this has been very helpful for a large number of, Marines and other audience members, civilian, military around the globe, for getting a better understanding of this conflict and possible trajectories. Call it good here. And, maybe we can have a little bit of a breather here before we put out a next episode, but, always subject to circumstances on the battlefield.
Have a great weekend. And, thinking of those on the Ukrainian side still withstanding the invasion 1 year later.
You as well. Good weekend. And I hate when there are circumstances that sort of force the best parts of the human spirit to come forward. But we've certainly seen that in the resilience of the Ukrainian population over the last year. I think it's been accepted that this will define them as a country in a positive way, and they know exactly what they're doing and what they're fighting for. It's been a lesson to all of us watching on what it really means, like what the really hard things in life are, because it just makes a lot of the first world problems we talk about kind of melt away when you look at the actual life and death circumstances they've had to put up with and continue moving forward and surviving and enduring.
Yeah, and for Russia as well. Not the main victims here, but whatever happens with this conflict, like Putin's all in. When he leaves power, leaves this earth, which might be at the same moment, he's going to leave a much worse Russia than the one that he found. And that's basically going to define part of the next era of international relations.
Something's hard to think about today, right now, taking one crisis at a time. But yeah. there's suffering in many places that all come down to his decision to cross that border on February 24th. Thanks for joining us. As always, we depend on support and feedback from the Team Krulak community to constantly improve our offerings and reach a wider audience. So if you have feedback on this episode, please take a moment to fill out the survey linked in the show notes to help us do better. Also, if you enjoyed this episode, please hit the like button and subscribe to our channel on YouTube, or leave us a review on the podcast app of your choice. It truly does help us reach a wider audience. Thank you as always for your support, and we'll see you on the next episode.